and welcome to the VOX-Pol Next Generation Network workshop. The Next Gen Network is a VOX-Pol initiative of young scholars researching on online extremism, and the network offers space for early career researchers to connect, network, and develop as a next generation of scholars in the field. Our objectives are basically to foster collaboration, facilitate knowledge exchange, host conferences and workshop events where people can identify research synergies and opportunities to collaborate. And more importantly, we also provide training and resources to empower young researchers to become leading experts in their fields. And our network welcomes young researchers, including MA students in the advanced stages of the research and also our postgraduate students. Stay tuned for more information about our network. And today's workshop is on academic survival. And this is a part of a workshop series that's going to be running every semester, focusing on different things that we've identified as needs that young career researchers, early career researchers have. And today's workshop will focus on researcher safety, well-being, and ethics. And we have three expert speakers that are probably themselves as well, either early career researchers or they just left that particular stage of being early career researchers. We first have Dr. Ashton Kingdon, who's a lecturer in criminology at the University of Southampton, and her research interests are in terrorism, radicalization, extremism, climate change, and their intersection with technology. And then we have Dr. Ashley Mattheis, who's a postdoctoral researcher in the Tech Against Terrorism Europe project at Dublin City University. Her work brings together cultural studies, media studies, and visual rhetorical criticism through the lens of feminist theory to explore the material effects of cultural production and consumption online, specifically digital cultures of extremism, including far-right, alt-right, QAnon, trad cultures, and the manosphere. And finally, we have Dr. Joe Whitaker, who's a lecturer in cyber threats, criminology, sociology, and social policy at Swansea University. And his research interests are in terrorist and extremist use of the internet, countering violent extremism, propaganda, and video games and extremism. So thank you all for coming, and also most especially thank you to the experts for actually agreeing to present in this particular workshop. And moving from that, we'll start with Dr. Ashton Kingdon, who will tell us more about her work in researcher safety. Thank you.
Thanks. I am just going to upload my slides. I'll be talking specifically about cybersecurity. I might just have to do it on live. I can't seem to, I don't know if you want to check yours, by the way, while we wait, but I can't upload from my live PowerPoint. So I don't know if you want to check that. I can just upload it manually. Can people see that, by the way? Smashing.
It's loading. Yeah, we can.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak to you all today. Yeah, my name's Ashton. I'm a lecturer at the University of Southampton in criminology. We're going to be talking to you specifically about the cybersecurity section of today, but I also am looking forward to discussing with my colleagues about their presentations, as well, as researcher safety and mental health are also really important components of research like this. So I finished my PhD last year. I spent 4 years undercover online as a white supremacist in various different corners of the interweb, ranging from neo-Nazi groups to the Klan, conspiracy theorists, QAnon communities, radical right populist groups, white nationalist groups, you name it, I was probably on there. Previously to that, I spent 8 months inside Islamic State networks, and I specifically look at the way that technology and imagery act as accelerators of radicalization. So I'm going to talk a bit today about the ethics of doing online research, but most importantly, some of the key tips, tools, tricks that I implemented during my research to help me stay safe online, which is extremely important if you are going to conduct research into sensitive material online, keeping safe is the #1 priority. Please feel free to put any questions in the chat if you want me to expand on anything in particular as I go through. So one of the things I want to talk about is I did collect research from the dark web. So if you're not as familiar with this particular delightful component of the internet, if you imagine everything that you look at on your Google search engines, on your social media, this is really only about 6% of what's available online. About the other 90% is what we refer to as the deep web, and about 4% of that is the dark web. So in order to access the dark web, you need to use specific tools, which I will go into more detail about. I didn't find particularly much of interest when I was looking at the far right online. They weren't really using the dark web very consistently or effectively. But needless to say, there are some cybersecurity implications that were really important if you are going to access this kind of material, which leads me to my kind of operational security ethical toolbox. So these are some things that I did that I would highlight to any researchers as being particularly important if you're going to start collecting data disseminated by extremist groups or deviant subcultures that are operating online. So in order to access the dark web, I use the Onion router, which is abbreviated to Tor. One thing that I would say is if you are going to start collecting data from a section of the internet or the web that you're not familiar with, always make sure you either have training in how to do that before you start. And if you don't, you really need to kind of check with your supervisory team as to who can help you with that. You definitely don't want to be going into these areas of the web without prior information, knowledge, training. So some of the things I will say, when I was using Tor, I used hotspot Wi-Fi. So I wasn't actually connecting to any of the Wi-Fis that were available, but rather hotspotting. This is just an extra layer of cybersecurity, in addition to things I'm going to talk about. In my other kind of data collection, I always used a virtual private network. The one that I personally use is private internet access, which you do have to pay for, but it allows you to put yourself in different locations, which is extremely beneficial if you're like me and you're pretending to be someone else in a different location. That can be really, really helpful to helping you gain access to things. And it also keeps you safe. Fake accounts, I'm going to come back to that. I'm actually just going to put them all up so I can talk around them. But yeah, software and hardware, really important. So for me, during my PhD, I had a dedicated laptop for research. I had a burner laptop and a burner phone, and none of these computers intersected with my normal everyday computer that I would use for streaming, shopping, things like that. So everything was completely separate. My dedicated computer, you'll often find if you're collecting data for a university, they will want you to have that linked to the institution in some way. So for example, I had all of these rules in place when I first started, that I was to collect my data on the university site and I was to leave my laptop at the university when I'd finished with it. And this was kind of, I'm sure that the other speakers will talk a bit about this later, but this was part of my mental health protocols, like trying to really separate work from home. Of course, this got completely decimated during COVID, which is when I did the majority of my PhD, and that line completely became non-existent anymore. But yeah, that's something that I had in place. So this laptop was dedicated to that research, to that data, and it stayed on the institution's site. Now, I have a burner laptop for the dark web. I would advise if anyone is going to start using the dark web or wants to look at it or collect data from it, that you have a laptop that has nothing on it at all. You do not want to risk getting viruses from the kind of sites that are on there. So my computer was completely blank and just used solely for that. I also have a burner phone because I couldn't create a Telegram account without a phone number. And for some reason, when I was trying to create a Telegram account, it would be able to tell that your number was fake and not actually connected to a phone. So I had a burner phone. And yeah, I use encrypted email for all of my accounts that I am creating a email address in order to be able to have an account on that platform, which I'm going to come back to. So when you're using different social media platforms, some of them for my research are open, which completely eliminated any kind of issues in terms of having to create fake accounts. But a lot of them I did have to create a fake account. Now, the rules in academia ethically are completely different to like journalists who might be collecting data. Certainly in my institution, you had to avoid deception, but obviously there are lots of murky ethical grounds about things like consent, anonymity, etc. So my accounts had components of my name, but it wasn't my real name. I used my middle name and half of my surname for all of my sock puppets, except for one, which I'm going to talk about on the next slide, which was for a platform called Fascist Forge. And the other thing that's really important is make a list of hard limits or red lines before you start your research. I'm going to go into this in detail in the next slide about one particular one that stood out for me, but certainly I don't look at certain things. I don't like to look at things with children in or animals. That's just my preference. That's a hard line for me. And it's okay for you to have them as well when you start your research. You know, not everyone has to look at the most gruesome propaganda or the most heinous messages. So that was really important for me. So I want to talk a bit about Fascist Forge in terms of ethics. So I was on Fascist Forge for about 5 months, back in 2019 to 2020. You can see on there that there's 283 full members and there were 1,188 users. So I was in the kind of component of users rather than being a full member for reasons that I'm going to go into. So this is a really interesting platform. I love to talk about this platform in terms of it being like operating on older technologies. So generally the Web 1.0 technologies. And also out of the 283 full members, like 17 of them were calling for direct acts of terrorism and were linked to groups like Atomwaffen, which were a really small percent. Like for a really small group of people, that's a huge percentage of people that are actually openly calling for terrorism. So my account on this platform, I was a National Socialist and also I do a lot of work on the occult. So it was around esoteric Hitlerism. So I created an account with a fake email address and components of my real name. Now, I said I was going to come back to the fact that you have to use certain components of your real name, but also you have to say what you're doing. So for example, on all of my accounts, it states that I'm a researcher. Now, in order to get on Fascist Forge, you had to be male. So this was the only platform where I actually used my first name, which is traditionally associated as a male name rather than a female name, which is how I got around that. Now, in terms of the red lines, so in order to become a full member on Fascist Forge, you had to complete an exam. There were lots of questions on this exam, and they took it really seriously. They also had things like DNA tests to show how Aryan your blood was. But this is a really good example of like what a red line is or a hard line, right? I wouldn't go into that level of deception in order to get access to probably more interesting information, because I just wouldn't deceive people. And also I didn't feel comfortable answering the questions and having to create the answers that they obviously wanted you to in order to pass the exam. So that's an example of like how I stayed on the periphery and still collected really important data, but didn't go into that next level. And the other thing I want to talk about is some of the tools that I used and the potential ethics around them. That's quite important for you, particularly if you're going to be using technologies to create and get data. So I use a lot of OSINT tools in my research, and it's really important that you remember that you are a white hat hacker, as they say. You don't want to do anything that is unethical or potentially deceptive or harmful to your participants, as many of them will not be aware that their data is being used in your research. So some of the tools that I was involved with, I'm going to talk in depth about Sherlock, Maltego and Shodan. But John the Ripper is a password cracker and Airgeddon is a Wi-Fi disruptor. So there are ethics around these kind of things. Shodan is probably, that's the one I use in all of my cybercrime lectures. The students are terrified when I show them what Shodan can do. So this has been labelled as the world's most dangerous search engine. I'm going to show you how I used it in my research, but essentially, rather than searching the web, this is a search engine for the Internet of Things, and it's designed to see vulnerabilities in that. So essentially, if you've got an open webcam that's uncovered, if there's some sort of password vulnerability, Shodan is designed to pick that up. So the students are often terrified of the fact that none of them cover their cameras on anything. I used it to trace where the people were hosting Fascist Forge when I was on there. And obviously it can tell you where that's coming from, but also the vulnerabilities within that network that they themselves might not even be aware of, which is super useful if you're giving this data or information to like counter-terrorism agencies, social media companies, etc. The other thing I was using was Multigo, which is an open source intelligence tool that's designed to kind of gather information. Again, one thing I would advise when you're using things that are open source intelligence is to get some training on this, on what kind of data it's ethical to not just get, but also do things with. I'm going to come back to that, but that's a really important point. I specifically used it to see who was hosting Fascist Forge and the times and dates of this, because Fascist Forge was kind of the website that sprang up after Iron March shut down. And it's really interesting to see how they come up in circulation. So essentially what this is going to show you is that there is a legitimate person that owns that domain. It tells you where they're registering it from. But it also tells you that they also had a separate domain connected to that they were hosting in the Cayman Islands, which essentially just means that they're cyber squatting that domain. So if that comes down off the internet, they can spring back up immediately with a mirror site because they also own that domain. The reason that I like to use Fascist Forge and Iron March as examples, particularly linked with OSINT, is that's an example of a tool that I use, which gave me really useful information. Again, I specifically used this data when it was the overview of the Prevent strategy back in 2019 to show that the far right were a threat, and these are the reasons why. And this was really good concrete data that I could use to show them that they were networked and that they were hosting these sites in multiple locations. The reason that OSINT is really interesting is I received a huge swathe of information from someone that had managed to get into the back door of both Fascist Forge and Iron March. And they had basically all of the data in terms of private conversations and things like that. And there was a big discussion about the ethics of using this. Personally, I don't. Other researchers might choose that they want to use that kind of data. I don't use it in my research, but that's another example of, you know, ethically what you might want to do, what you might not want to do. The other thing that's really interesting about this is you can use data to find multiple people. Now, I'm going to get onto the ethics of this, but essentially a tool that I use is Sherlock, which essentially you can code to search for usernames that are everywhere across all the different social media platforms. So this is Pidgey, who is a really high profile propagandist on Fascist Forge. I feel like basically there was a kind of expose about one of the other people that he was working with called Dark Foreigner, and I think someone kind of whistle blew who that was. But you can tell this propaganda, it's super famous aesthetic of siege culture kind of material. Now, what this basically enabled me to do really quickly, and that's one of the benefits of learning kind of technological ways of getting data, is that it could tell me wherever the accounts were on all different social media platforms, which is really useful when you're trying to figure out if people are operating and spreading propaganda on different platforms at the same time. Now, the reason that this is interesting ethically is I obviously use their really public usernames in order to track this. You could use email addresses, and you also could use full names, which you can access through OSINT tools as well. So you could easily find all of their private social media accounts, private email addresses, things like that, which again, I don't do because ethically, I think that is problematic. Last thing I want to touch on, this is mainly for my research because I basically only look at images unless I'm forced to look at text for some reason. Remove your metadata from your images when you put them in your publications. This is really important. You do not want to be sharing anything that could link back to someone that might have shared it. There's questions about what propaganda you should even share. Personally, I do include examples of propaganda as a way of a kind of digital literacy learning experience. But please make sure you remove your metadata from that. You can do this in several ways. Personally, for me, I like to either take a screenshot so that you're not actually collecting that image and storing it on your computer. If I do have images on my computer, then you can literally just left click on your desktop and remove the metadata from them. And that gets around that barrier. So yeah, that was what I had to say. I'm happy to have any questions at the end, or if you want me to expand on anything, I'd be happy to. But yeah, thank you so much for listening, and I will hand over to Miraj. Thank you, Miraj.
Thank you, Ashton. That was very insightful, and thank you for sharing your own experiences of how you went about it, but also I think most especially the kind of tools that are already out there and what you can do with those tools in reality, and at the same time try to remain safe. So next, we're actually going to have Ashley talk to us about ethics, and I think specifically Ashley's really strong on institutional responsibility. So over to you, Ashley.
Hello, everyone. I'm hoping that you can all see my slides. Great, thank you. Okay, so my name is Ashley Matthias. I am a scholar of communication and media. And I come to thinking about sort of the ethics of this online safety, researcher safety through my own sort of experiences working with the materials, thinking through my methodological training, which doesn't sort of jive with the type of work I do in some ways, and trying to find a pathway for myself, as well as my own experiences with conducting this research without proper training in things like OPSEC and just how to do this and safely. And that's primarily because the people that were training me didn't know, they didn't do this work. So because sort of online terrorism, extremism, and hate research crosses many disciplines, and there's no unified discipline of internet research, a lot of us come from different places with different training, and we don't always get sort of the things we need up front. And that's something that's being recognized more and more in the field today. So I'm going to start back with sort of basic ethics in terms of what we think of when we say research ethics. Research ethics is primarily comprised of three types of components. The first is research design, and that is planning how you're going to conduct research. The second is research conduct, right? So then how are you going to do the research and what are the parameters there? And the third is compliance, and this is the sort of regulatory frame around conducting safe research. And this has the most ties to legislation and institutional policy in many ways. The other two areas are much more driven by sort of disciplinary norms and practices. So let's take a quick look at what that looks like. So in the traditional research setting, where we would be working in the offline context, right, there has been, you know, decades and decades, if not in some cases hundreds of years of debate and discussion about ethical research, how to design research, how to conduct research, and what to do. And this has been bounded by our disciplinary norms, right? So humanities norms are different from social science norms, are different from natural sciences norms, are different from medical norms. Not that they aren't in conversation with each other at times, and certainly today, there's a lot more discussion across those things because of things like multi, inter, and transdisciplinary research, where people are applying other forms of research design and methods to what they're doing. But this has a very particular context, history, and material driver than the type of research we're doing. So within that frame, right, research design is going to be driven by your disciplinary commitments, your ethical commitments. Even within a particular discipline, there's going to be bifurcations, right? So within a field, something like anthropology, over time, there's developed a debate around extractive research versus positivist research that they still debate. So there's two like lines of approach there that you might have to learn across. And so that's driven in that way. To conduct research, how we do research follows from our research design and our commitments to whether we're working with texts, working with people, working with quote unquote data, like numeric quantitative data, or even big data in some cases. And so there's protocols around how we do that. And sometimes those come into conflict and those have to be resolved. But generally that is also driven by that research design coming out of your discipline. And third is compliance. And compliance is pretty unique because it's different in different geographic locations, different countries, even within countries have different compliance requirements. Something as simple as like the GDPR in the UK is going to make a different form of compliance in the UK than it would be anywhere else. In my case, coming from the US, our compliance is run through what's called an institutional review board at most universities. We don't necessarily have ethics review committees. And the Institutional Review Board is primarily or often concerned with things like participant safety in medical research or direct participant work research. And it's concerned with things like keeping researchers safe in a lab. Like, so if you're using caustic chemicals, you have to wear gloves and eyeglasses. It sounds sort of zhuzhun, but it's part of what that regulation around safety in research is. Now, that is well and good, and those are all good things. You can get training on compliance and conduct of research at most universities. Your training in design would come typically from your department. But we run into a wall when we get the internet and how research works on the World Wide Web and how that's developed. And in terms of the time in the debates around ethics or even questioning ethics or experiencing and seeing effects of work, right? Internet research is young. It is still very young. And so what happens is people who came to this research first came with their disciplinary training, their compliance knowledge, their conduct knowledge from their background, and started to apply that in this context. But there are a few problems here. And so let's talk about what makes internet research sort of different from other contexts. So first is the scale and the scope. We talk about this quite often. But when we say scale and scope, we mean the mass amounts of data available online, the mass amounts of information. We could even be talking about the interconnectivity and networks associated with it. We are looking at availability of data without form and structure in many ways compared to something like an archive, which has already had a structure imposed on it. And so as internet researchers, when we engage this, we impose form and structure in order to conduct research systematically. And that is a thing that is different from other contexts in particular kinds of ways. From anything like, how do you match up different types of data pieces? So like a tweet here, a blog post there, a video. How do you work your way through different types of data that you might be working with, images, interviews, to really like, what does it mean to bring corpuses together from different places or text together from different places and make your own corpus, and how does that impact what we're doing? It's not that that doesn't happen in the other areas of research, it's that it is particular to this type of research that we do this on a regular basis, and often we do it without necessarily thinking through all the implications or being transparent about them. So that's sort of the first thing. The second thing is, in the work we're doing specifically in internet research, we are working on violent actors, terrorists, extremists, hatefulness, in some cases criminal activity, and that changes our relationship to the work that we're doing. Now, if you come from one of the more traditional fields, you might have had training in what it is to work with quote unquote difficult data or quote unquote dangerous data. But if you come from non-traditional fields in this area, so like I come from communication, other people from media studies, other people from anthropology, right? This is a slightly different approach because our home disciplines do not necessarily foreground training in how to deal with these types of topics in the same way. So you have this combination of this like different research context along with this sort of specialized research topical arena and its own problems. Third, we have something that is unique to the online context in many ways, which is online harm. And not just online harm to participants. You may see people being harmed, but online harm targeted at researchers very specifically. And very specifically marginalized scholars, so BIPOC scholars, LGBTQ+ scholars, women scholars, and that also includes, in this case, early career researchers. That is not an identity position, but it is a category that we are assigned to in our work that gives us a differing level of access to support at the institution and a differing level of sort of engagement, which puts us in a particular position when people target us online. So this whole piece of online harms and researcher safety is a very big discussion across groups doing internet research, but topically for people doing extremism and terrorism online research, it becomes increasingly important given the fact that you are always already working with actors that conduct activities like this online. And because you need to publish, because you need to talk about your work and share your work online, that amps up the sort of likelihood that at some point someone may target you. Okay. So what does this mean? It means there are some sort of key issues and debates in ethics in our work that stand out. And the first is sort of around data sourcing and what that means on the internet. So we talk about this often as the public-private split, which Ashton sort of referenced in many ways in her talk as well. Are you gathering your data from a public source or are you getting private data from somewhere? And this is a very big issue in online because that is not always clear and often it is unclear. To this, I would add, this is not a medium that is like a static data source, right? I'll talk about this more, but like our online spaces, communities. This is something that we have to start thinking about as a group of scholars. The second issue is researcher and participant power relations. This tends to come up most often when there's participant research, right? Issues of informed consent. Maura Conway's put out pieces about how informed consent has to be considered in the internet space, right? There's people in our own field talking about this, but there are some inherent problems here. How do you provide informed consent to people that want to target you? Right? Christian Fuchs talks about that in some great detail, and I have citations for these things if folks want them. But so informed consent and relations of power are a little bit skewed in the online space, especially if you are working in groups that target researchers. The third area is the potential for legitimation of a problematic ideology or a negative ideology. And along with that comes the reliability of our interlocutors, right? In the last couple of years, there have been some very big debates about the use of quote unquote, former extremists and terrorists in our research. This has to deal with the reliability of interlocutors and legitimation of ideology. If you do interviews with an extremist and then do that work, are you legitimating their ideology? Are they a reliable interlocutor? This is an issue. There has been quite a bit of very good research that does participant work, but you have to like think through the process of taking a critical stance and questioning the reliability of your interlocutor at that point and making certain commitments in order to do that work without reproducing harm. In the same way that Ashton talks about sharing images and thinking through sharing images or propaganda materials as a research exercise, when we talk to people or when we're sharing people's thoughts from online, we have to think carefully about what effects that could have later on and how we try to mitigate any potential harmful effects. And so this is a big issue in this discussion. And then the last is sort of this issue of online harms and safety. And as Mirage said, my framework is institutional responsibility. We talk quite a bit about what individual people can do. Like Ashton mentioned, she has bright lines, like hard lines that she doesn't cross. I also have them. About how I do my research, like one of mine is if the propaganda, if the research on things I'm looking at ever stop bothering me, if I get numb to them, I'm done. I'm walking from this research. Like at that point, I know that that's a problem for me. But there's different tactics you can take to protect yourself. However, we are conducting this research on behalf of our institutions. Our institutions make money and get branding out of this. And other researchers doing other work get institutional support. So we have to figure out how institutional support works here. And I'm really being nutsy and boltsy here, right? Like, if you need an ergonomic chair at work, you get an ergonomic chair. If we need a VPN to do our work, we should get VPN, right? So we can talk about that in more detail. And, you know, just to be fully transparent, Ashton and I do write together about this topic, so there may be some overlap in things we've said. But so these are unique to sort of internet research on extremism and terrorism online, with overlaps in just general internet research questions. So in thinking through some of these things, let's start with sort of public versus private. Twitter is a platform that most academic researchers would consider public, right? It's okay to go get data from Twitter because the people who are posting that data, who are posting their tweets, sorry, I refuse to call it X, who are posting their tweets know that it's public and therefore it's okay, right? That gets a little murkier with something like Facebook. Do you make friends? Do you add yourself to do research on someone without informing them? Do you lurk in a Facebook group? Even if it's an open group, if the people in the group think it's a closed, like it's private to their constituents, is that ethical, right? Same thing with Telegram. Telegram should be private. It's an encrypted chat program, but sometimes people share join links that you can just click and join a channel. Do you need to provide informed consent? Do you need to tell them who you are? What is the ethical line there, right? And this is quite hotly debated. And it's actually a very important thing, because it isn't just about what we can get away with as researchers. It's about what that digital community, remember I said community would come up again, what that community talking to each other, even if they're talking asynchronously, like not at the same time, thinks is happening, right? It's about the ethics of dealing with people. So the internet is a place where texts are associated with people in a way that it isn't in other places. Like, for example, if an author publishes a book, that text is discrete, it's out there, it doesn't get updated, people don't respond to it in the text itself, right? On the internet, they do, right? Are you going to study a blog post and look at the comments? If you look at the comments, individual people left those comments. That is not the same thing as a public speaker leaving a blog post, right? You have to navigate all of that and really think through the ethics of what that is in line with your disciplinary commitments. And in particular, that comes up for me because I have some specific disciplinary commitments to non-extractive research and to communicating with participants. And I don't do participant research. So I have to be very clear that I only work on public channels, very clearly public data, right? I'm not going to provide informed consent to people that want to target me. I'm not comfortable with that. But that shapes what happens in my research. It shapes my access to data. It shapes the kind of research I do, which can have its own problems. If you're only looking at ideologues and not looking at everyday users, that shapes the research. So how do we deal with that? We talked a little bit already about informed consent and reliability of interlocutors, but again, that feeds into what you're doing. Is a very public figure a more reliable interlocutor than an everyday user, right? How do you navigate that? So these are the sort of problems as they work in sort of everyday use. My sort of solution to this, and I would say the fact that we are debating these things is an intrinsic sort of an acknowledgement of the status of the internet as a place that is a community as opposed to a place that is a data source, right? We sometimes treat it as a data source, but it is a data source that involves people all the time. So my argument, and a paper I've got coming out here in the new year, looks at digital research as fieldwork and thinking about what does it mean to do our work on texts that are actively involving engagement with people, people's response, people in community. This is not an argument to say that we should all have to do participant research. It's an argument to say this shapes how our data work and what the ethics of working with that data are. So how does this then inform or change our view? How does it necessitate a different view? Well, first, we have to understand particularly social platforms, but digital platforms as communities. So this means they act in many ways like a field site as opposed to a data source, right? We might be interacting, we might not be interacting, but if we're not interacting, we're probably lurking in someone's community. If you were doing that in a village, that would be ethically problematic, right? So how do you think through this? And I'm not suggesting that people have to, again, apply participatory research rules to what they're doing, but it necessitates us thinking about what does it mean and how does it shape what we're doing. And this becomes even more complicated when we get to computational digital research, because computational work abstracts us even further from the reality that these platforms involve people, and people are there while we're doing our work, right? Okay. So for me and my work, what this necessitated was really thinking through, as I said, I was trained in essentially decolonizing methodologies and intersectionality, and those foreground like very heavy engagement with research participants and communities, co-producing knowledge, non-extractive research. This is a problem when you work on like the manosphere or the far right and you are an identity that they target. So I knew I didn't want to do that, but I still have the commitment. So I had to rethink like, okay, what are the steps in designing my research in this way? And for me then, things like my commitments to ethical knowledge production, ethical work with participants, collaboration, had to become a paradigm, right? So they shape how I ask my questions. So before I ever get to designing the research or picking a methodology or methods, I have to think about like, how am I asking the question? How is that shaped by my commitments? What impact does it have on my research? Right? And that is that paradigm level. So that's a way you can do it. You can apply things that you are committed to ethically in the paradigm and frame how you even begin to ask the question. That feeds into your methodology, which shapes your approach and analysis, right? So the methodology drives which methods are available to use and how you will analyze them. I'm a critical scholar. I do critical interpretive research. That type of methodology means that I look at roles of power, right? That shapes the methods I'm going to use then following that, particularly in this context of texts that are not discrete texts. And then in terms of methods, those shape the data you collect, they shape how you process the data, and they shape your project findings to a certain extent, right? So for me, I use grounded interpretive methods. I use the text itself, themes that emerge from the text. So I'm not applying a model on top. And using that sort of grounded approach for me keeps me honest to the text itself. It is a way I can use to ethically check what I'm doing as I think about the work as the project is going on. And what you find when you sort of make this shift is that it necessitates a different view of data, often for many of us, which is first that data doesn't exist independently, right? This is not the researcher from nowhere or what Donna Haraway calls the God trick, right? Research choices shape our data, right? So our research choices, the way we generate our data, right? Our methods shape the data. Data is intersubjective, right? We have a role in this process that impacts the outcome. And what this sort of leads me to argue for is a form of research design called reflexive research design, which primarily comes out of allied and public health and social work. So these are people who are working with participants all the time. And they ask questions in their research design about their positionality, which indicates thinking about power and relationality to participants. What are their assumptions and their biases that might be impeding or affecting their research? About being transparent, right? In this case, you might have whole statements about how you structured your research and who you are as a researcher and how that impacts what you're doing. And they think about their choices and how those choices are driven by those three: positionality, assumptions, and transparency, and then the effects of their choices. So this sort of framework allows us to ask questions about how and why we're doing, what impact it has, what the effects were, and it's an iterative process, but it can be applied regardless of the than methods you use, right? It's a layer we can use to sort of think through what we're doing. And one of the reasons I think this would be a very successful way for people to start applying an ethical frame is because sort of the two extant frameworks that are developing right now for how to do ethical research on the far right or ethical internet research, which are at the bottom of the slide. So FRETS, the Framework for Ethical Research in Terrorism Studies, which was by Morrison, Silka, and Bont in 2021. And the AOIR, which is the Association of Internet Researchers Guide, the third part. Both draw on a very question-oriented or reflexive approach to engaging with questions of ethics. For FRETS, that's geared toward researchers, but also review committees. The AOIR is predominantly geared toward research committees. But in both cases, there are these banks of questions that researchers are supposed to ask themselves about what you're doing, how you're doing, and having clarity on that. And that is a form of reflexive research design. So I think many of us are pushing in this direction. In fact, a new, very recent paper that came out in the last week or two also pushed into this idea of reflexive research design. And again, I have a citation for that can be shared. So this is just sort of the state of the art in the field at the moment. The idea of the digital as fieldwork is my argument for why we need it. But along with that, we have really good resources at VOX-Pol. If you are already in VOX-Pol, it's great, but the website, just the general website, has an ethics section that is amazing. The Reassure project at VOX-Pol, which I'm sure Joe will talk quite a bit about, also is one of the first empirical studies of researchers in our field and how they relate to these issues. There's also been really recently, Antonia Vaughn just also put out a slightly smaller empirical study that was published a month ago. And I do have a site for that as well. And then the AOIR is a community you can join. They do all kinds of things. They have a conference, they have all kinds of information, but it's based on internet research, not extremist research online. So it's a little broader of a thing. And then I do have a list here of non-academic resources for online safety. In case you're a practitioner, in case you want to share these, in case you're just not finding what you need in academic stuff. These come from journalism. These come from a variety of different fields that also deal with these kind of problems. And you can just throw these into Google. We can make sure people get this if they need it, and the links should come up for those. And I just wanted to say thank you so much. I hope you're finding the information you need to do this well. As someone who didn't necessarily have the tools in the beginning and had to develop this over time, I'm really excited that you're all here thinking about this now.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you. That was a lot to think about, but at the same time, like things that we constantly need to have in mind when we're designing research, because I think for a long time, this has been the practice in the offline domain. These are things we actually think about, things to do with reflexive research design, but you find that we don't employ the same thoroughness when it comes to the digital space. So thank you so much. And that actually ties really well with what Joe is going to talk to us about in terms of well-being. Specifically, he's done great work on the Reassure project, so I'm sure he has like really useful insights. Over to you, Joe.
Can people see my slides? Brilliant. Okie dokie. Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Miraj, and thank you, Ashley and Ashton. Obviously, there's going to be quite a lot of overlap in everything that's been said so far. But I thought I would focus a little bit more on the kind of psychological well-being. As you'll see as I go through this, the project that I was part of had a decent amount of stuff that related to physical, what we called kind of external threats as well. I'm going to focus mostly on the psychological issues for today, but if anyone has any questions about the latter, more than happy to talk about them in the Q&A. And obviously, it very much interlinks into what Ashton was talking about. So yes, I'm going to talk mostly about a project that I've been involved in for a few years now. As you'll see from the bottom of the screen, it is by no means a solo effort. There's a number of researchers, including Ashley, who's just spoken, that are involved in the project. So A little bit of a very, very quick primer first, and I'm going to try and make me talking relatively short because I know we're out in about half an hour or maybe about 40 minutes, so keen to get it done before then. So yeah, thinking about researching extremism online, there's been kind of a growing conversation about ethics. So I started my PhD in about 2016, and there wasn't really too much going on about it then. I think it wasn't too uncommon to, go to a conference or anything like that and not really have too much in the way of conversations about ethics. But I think for the most part that all changed when it came to the rise of the so-called Islamic State. And what we found was that we started to test the bounds of, what could be considered ethical research. And in particular, lots of conversations about researcher welfare started to pop up. This was in large part necessitated by the large numbers of people, researchers in this field, that were watching kind of huge hours of very distressing types of content. A few little workshops started to pop up. So we hosted one here in Swansea in 2018, and then that summer as well, the VOX-Pol conference in Amsterdam, we had a specific session dedicated to researcher welfare and ethics. And then exactly as Ashley beat me to the punch here slightly, but there has been in the last few years a little bit more recent research that's popped up, thinking specifically about the ethics and in particular researcher welfare. So with that in mind, I'm going to speak a little bit about the project that I was part of. I'm not going to go into too much granular detail, not least because I've only got about 15 minutes, I think, and secondly because we actually did a launch for VOX-Pol, and you can find kind of a full hour session just dedicated to this report on there. So I'm not going to what do they call it, flog a dead horse too much with that. But to give a little bit of context. We ran the Reassure project, and it was a small team of 5 institutions, and it was set up with a little grant money from the 2019 TASM conference. And the institutions involved were Swansea, Dublin City University, Royal Holloway University, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, and Hidayah. And we were thinking specifically about researcher welfare in the online space. And earlier this year, we published a report, kind of it's about 100 pages long. It's pretty extensive, looking specifically about, we conducted interview-based research and looking at exactly what researchers in the field had said about their own kind of well-being within this field. We added to that in the summer of 2022 with a workshop in London, in which we went beyond the people researching this kind of content, but also wanted to begin to interact with people that were practicing in this field as well. So it's both sorts of people like law enforcement, like people working for NGOs and think tanks, that potentially experienced the same sort of harms, but maybe had fundamentally quite different institutional structures. And then we also were very keen on talking to people maybe from what you might call adjacent fields that may have similar lessons that we could help to learn from. So that may, for example, it included people working in child sexual exploitation, kind of content moderation, social media and things like that, to see if there were things that we could learn from people that had potentially similar experiences from adjacent fields. And it is, of course, worth plugging the VOX-Pol lecture series. I did a session specifically thinking about this project and perceptions of the research ethics process, which a lot of it rings true with the sorts of things that Ashley was talking about before. So just very brief overview of the project. So we did interview-based research with 39 Western-based academics. Keen to put an asterisk to the fact that it was deliberately Western-based, not because there should be any kind of priority to that, is that our view was that people from the Global South had a very distinct, separate set of challenges. But one of the things we're looking to do in future is work with partners at universities in the Global South, so we can research this properly rather than sending 5 Western researchers over and kind of potentially not truly very well understanding the kind of dynamics involved there. We developed these kind of interviews from our own personal networks and professional networks, and fundamentally we were trying to answer 3 research questions. The first was, what are the harms that researchers face when conducting terrorism and extremism research online. The second is, what do they do to mitigate these harms? And then finally, thinking, what level of institutional support did they receive? So I'm going to go over a few of these kind of findings from each of these research questions as they relate to researcher mental health. Little brief thing on the kind of the demography of the sample. So it was mostly people working within a university setting, although some that were working either within think tanks, government-funded institutions, which is a bit more the norm in Scandinavia, as well as private institutions. We tried as best we could for an equal gender balance, although it ended up being slightly more skewed towards men. The sample was mostly people that identified as white or white Jewish, with only about, I think, about 25% being people of color, and then based around 9 different countries and representing 13 different nationalities. In terms of the sorts of things that they were researching, it was pretty evenly split between jihadism, the far right, with a smaller number of people who were researching incels. And then an interesting split of about 1/3 of the participants were senior academics, so they had been working in their job for I think 8 years was the cutoff we had, and then the majority, about 2/3 of the participants, were early career researchers. So you can get a kind of a snapshot there of the sorts of people that we spoke to. So yeah, as I mentioned, I'm going to speak mostly about what we called the internal types of harm, but I think it's worthwhile just talking about 3 different types of harm that we identified, and I'm happy to go into a little bit more detail about the other 2 in the Q&A if necessary. So the first, which I kind of left mostly clear because I figured it would be quite related to the sorts of things that Ashton was talking about before, but a lot of participants that we were speaking to spoke about a range of what we titled external harms. So this ranged from everything from death threats and fear of life to doxing to online harassment. So basically harms that were being done to people actively and deliberately. The second, which I'll focus on for most of the rest of this presentation, is what we would call internal harms. So things that are mostly psychological in nature. And yes, I realize it's a bit of a clunky dichotomy because a lot of the external things that people were doing to people was causing internal harms, but it was more for the purposes of structuring our way of thinking about it. I do recognize it's not the most defensible dichotomy. But importantly as well, and I will get to this in a little bit more detail later on, we found that the first 2 types of harm created a third harm, which was the professional harm. And as we all know, everyone who works in any kind of research, be it academic or otherwise, realizes that it's a public role. And by choosing to withdraw yourself and not be so much in the public eye, or not doing kind of the kinds of research which is very popular at that exact moment, you can end up suffering some kind of professional harm. So in terms of the type of content that people were looking at, researchers were really, over our sample, looking at a huge range of platforms. So this goes everything from the quote unquote mainstream social media platforms of Facebook, Twitter, to these kind of anonymous or pseudonymous forums like the Chans, as well as all the way to the dark web. And a range of different websites and end-to-end encrypted chats and things like that. So really the whole array of ecosystems when it comes to both jihadism and the far right. People were also looking at a range of different types of kind of multimedia content. So some people were looking at text and doing these big manifesto trawls. Some people were looking, like Ashton said, specifically at images, whereas other people were looking at either video, and even some people were looking listening specifically to certain types of sounds like anashid and things like that. A lot of the takeaway was that a lot of the kind of content that was being engaged with was fundamentally either violent in nature, and a lot of this would speak specifically to jihadist propaganda, very, very gruesome beheading videos, other kinds of execution videos, as well as other kinds of violence too. Now that made up an important and quite common way in which people were engaging in content. But in a weird, a lot of other participants suggested that it was perhaps things that were more on the kind of offensive and hateful that may have elicited a fundamentally quite different reaction, but also one that caused a problem. And this perhaps came a little bit more from people that were researching either the far right or perhaps incels as well, that the kind of sheer volume of absolutely toxic, hateful language created a range of kind of adverse effects. A lot of our participants reported that they were looking at this kind of content in extraordinarily high volume and intensity, often reporting doing it without really proper breaks or anything like that. And that led to a range of negative effects that I will speak about in the next slide. Now, one of the really important takeaways, I think, and this is one of the reasons that I'm so keen to do workshops like this, is that a good number, a minority, but still a very good number of our 39 participants said that they were not aware of the sorts of things that they might be looking at and the sorts of risks that they posed before beginning and embarking on their research. So, and oftentimes it may have just been they sort of started a PhD, for example, and just sort of went poking around, and they were just kind of looking at things online because it felt like keeping up with what was happening in their field of research. But at no point did either a more senior kind of a supervisor or someone like that, or perhaps someone in a more of a firm institutional role, like someone in an ethics committee, actually tell them the sorts of risks that they may have faced. And in fact, a lot of people who are now senior academics suggested that the first time that they really started thinking about internal psychological researcher welfare was when they became team leaders and realized that they didn't want the next generation of scholars to kind of fall victim to the same lack of transparency and lack of insight that they had. Talk a little bit about some of the potential effects. A number of people, and Ashley spoke about this earlier, that desensitization is certainly a common response for people that are looking at large swathes of either gruesome or extremely hateful content. It is presumably a natural way in which our bodies deal with just kind of looking at this really awful kind of toxic stuff all kind of over repeated periods of time, is that you have to develop some kind of coping mechanism, and this kind of self-numbing and finding yourself, kind of removing your emotion from it is quite a natural one. Now, from one perspective, you might think that that isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world, but actually a lot of our participants said that actually made them feel extremely inhuman, that they felt that they kind of lost their emotions and kind of humanity from what is obviously extremely distressing types of content. A lot of people spoke about changes in mood as well. So it may be anything from feeling more tearful to having a low mood to feeling depressed. People, and this is, I suppose, a point in which psychological meets physiological, but a lot of people spoke about trouble sleeping, developing nightmares, as well as kind of being more anxious and things like that. And a lot of people, and that point of anxiety is an important one as well, because it wasn't necessarily always just anxiety about the content they were looking at, but also a lot of people felt quite anxious about the law and making sure that they were kind of staying on the right side of it while being involved in our kind of research. A smaller number of people reported things, and I want to be really careful here because none of us are trained clinical psychologists, but a lot of people reported things that are in line with what you might think of as post-traumatic stress disorder, so including hallucinations, flashbacks, and very morbid, intrusive thoughts as well. And in terms of what that caused people to do, a lot of people reported that they felt themselves isolating, almost deliberately isolating themselves because they didn't want their poor mood to kind of infect their family and friends, and finding themselves more withdrawn from social situations. So I think that is I've painted quite a negative picture here. So hopefully what I will do now is talk a little bit about some of the ways in which our participants stated that they tried to mitigate these kinds of harms and kind of tips and tricks that they wanted to share. Now, I want to be really, really clear before I get onto these that we are not yet at the point with this project where what I'm about to say is quote unquote best practice. We're really keen not to use that word until we've developed a guidance which is actually evidence-based and is something which is kind of has quite a strong literature backing it up. So what I'm about to talk to you about are things that professionals in this field have said that they've done, and they are all personally things that I would endorse, but it's not something that we're quite happy to actually call best practice yet. So some people talk specifically about being important to work set hours. One of the harms that people spoke about before was that they were kind of not really respecting the kind of 9 to 5, and they were just working all the way through the night, and that was one of the things that was affecting their sleeping. But they found that working set hours was a very useful way of dealing and being able to switch off at the end of the day. Similarly, working in a specific location, very important as well. I understand that that's somewhat privileged, particularly when I'm talking to PhD students, because there might not necessarily be a specific workspace for you, but it is also worth inquiring to see if arranging something like that would be possible if you're looking at content which might cause some level of distress. As part of both of those two things, just a general idea of finding some way to demarcate working from not working. So one of our participants actually reported that they put on a white kind of lab coat as if they were a chemist or something like that, literally working in the lab, simply because putting it on and taking it off gave them a really clear demarcation of this is work time and I'm going to do it. And then when this is off, I don't have to engage or think about it. Obviously, it's kind of a symbol, but it's one that this participant reported as being useful. Kind of related to the specific location as well, a lot of people were concerned not just about traumatizing themselves, but if they were working, for example, in a PhD room where there might be any number of, up to a dozen or 24 other PhD students, that they might see the kind of content that was viewable on their screen. So people trying to mitigate these harms by requesting different kinds of workspaces. When it comes to specifically graphic content, a lot of people reported minimizing the screen. So it's actually, kind of a teeny tiny box, perhaps no bigger than the size of some of these Teams boxes that you can see us on. There's not necessarily, it can be a way of kind of not seeing the gore in quite as much detail. Similarly, you can reduce the screen brightness, so it's absolutely down to minimum. And again, it just kind of obfuscates the view to the point in which a lot of people reported that that it helped. And then similarly, if necessary, reducing the volume, or even in some cases, if the volume was not necessary for what they were doing, playing it without sound at all. So yeah, a range of different ways in which individuals mitigated harms. This is only a handful, so do feel free to go to our full reports if you were interested in kind of seeing what some other ones were. So I focused a little bit on individual coping strategies. I'll just talk now a little bit about how individual teams and networks could be used to try and mitigate some of these harms. So it was found to be generally very useful when there were ways in which people could talk to team members about their work. And again, I understand that as PhD students, you're not all going to be equal when it comes to that. There's going to be some of you that are part of institutions where there's 4, 5, 6 other PhD students working on the same sort of thing, and potentially just going for a coffee or going to the pub and talking about it is an option. And in that situation, as long as everyone is a willing participant in that conversation, that's a good idea. But obviously, don't do so if people don't want to hear about it. But also, we found that for those researchers that were working in isolation, there was actually a huge community of people online that they could reach out to and work with others in the field. So that might simply be via Twitter or Blue Sky or whatever we're using now, or it may have been specifically seeking people out at conferences and building a shared community there. I mentioned this before, but again, a lot of the more senior researchers mentioned that they found it useful just to communicate from their own experience to, about what the needs and risks are to other people, just kind of spreading the story and just getting it out there, just so no one, hopefully, at the very least, can enter into a long research project in this field, not knowing the sorts of things that they might find. And then finally, very important as well is the idea of promoting the inclusion of budgets for researcher welfare when you are planning your research project and you're building a grant bid. So just finish up a little bit by talking about institutional support. So there was a pretty wide variability when it comes to counselling. Some people did have counselling available for free. Others had it kind of part funded, but others had no access to it at all. So there was generally an idea that kind of a suggested idea by many participants that if they were building up a grant bid from the bottom up, that it would be a very good idea to include counselling if there was a possibility of looking at this kind of content. And then also when it comes to the process of engaging with ethical review, I know Ashley's spoken about this a lot already, but many participants described engaging with the ethics process as very difficult, and importantly that there was very often little focus on researcher welfare, that instead it was much more focused on participant welfare. However, importantly, there was a belief that a greater use of the ethics process may in some instances act as a barrier to research, which a lot of other participants were concerned about too. So just to wrap up, I think one of the just to kind of real blue sky summarize at the end, a lot of participants kind of said that they experienced a range of what we call internal, what you might call psychological harms, and a lot of them suggested that it manifested in ways that negatively impacted their career. I highlighted a range of tactics that could be used to attempt to mitigate it, and I think if there is one big takeaway, it is that there is now in 2023 quite a lot of literature to think about carefully when planning your project. And if you're at the stage where you're thinking about submitting an ethics application, there's now quite a lot of stuff out there that you can use. So with that, I'll finish up and just say that as well as questions, and I think other people have said that, we're really just happy to talk and hear about potential experiences at your end too. So I'll pass back to Miraj.
Thank you so much, Joe. Actually, I really like your second last slide because it kind of summarized everything that we've talked about so far, from the kind of harms that people experience, the kind of tactics that people use, but also how the entire conversation about ethics is something that we need to think about from the early stages of the research to very advanced stages, and even once you're actually disseminating your findings. So I think that's really good. I'm not seeing any questions from my end, so I'm not sure if any of the participants has posted a question or not.
I just wanted to say really quickly, thank you everyone for the presentation. So I turned on your ability to share your camera as well as to turn on your microphone, so we can kind of open it up. And Joe was talking about one of the points was to kind of create this community, so you don't suffer alone through researching online extremism. So that's kind of what this whole network and series is all about. So yeah, feel free to turn your camera on if you want to talk, or just submit something in the Q&A.
We have a hand up.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this session. It was so informative and very helpful. And thank you to Joe and Ashton and Ashley for speaking about your experience. I just had a general question, being a third-year PGR PhD, about to sort of transition, hopefully, into academia. I've been looking at misogynist incels for 7 years now. I've done this all through my career. And the varying levels of institutional support that I've received through my career has been shockingly terrible. When I started, nobody in my discipline in criminology at my home institution was doing anything about online extremism. My MPhil was a dumpster fire in a department who literally had no idea about internet ethics, and they told me I didn't need ethical approval to just sort of do what I wanted, with no guidance, no counseling, no nothing. My current PhD has been a bit better, but I think there's been so many bumps in the road, and particularly as we're seeing so much more discussion around communities like these, around far right, the manosphere, a lot of polarizing topics. I think a lot of us feel, at least I can speak for myself, and that I feel a bit unsafe and unsupported. And I think that sort of stinted my ability to publish. So as I'm at the final end, who has the responsibility for our safety as we near the end of this sort of cradle of the PhD? Because we're not really staff, but we're also not students. We have funding. In my case, I do. But if there is something that happens to where I'm doxxed or I'm harassed or my safety is threatened at some point, is there an onus of care on our home institutions to actually follow that up? And does that end when we submit our PhD? Like, is there anything for us, sort of? I know that's a very existential question, but.
So I'm going to ask, are you in the US?
God, no. I'm in the
Okay.
UK, but
Okay.
my home institution was in Ottawa, Canada.
Okay. So the reason I asked that is because I did my PhD in the US and I was in the same position, right? Like, I'm a student when they want me to be a student. I'm staff when they want me to be staff, and I have zero support. Like, literally, I came to this because I actually went the first time I started getting harassed to the lawyers and said, by the way, it's an open campus. All my information has to be public under law. And people with guns might come to the campus and find my classroom. And they went, huh? Right? And I was like, yeah, it's kind of a thing, right? In the UK, with prevent, the university should have a prevent duty. There should be an officer there. I don't know, because I just did a postdoc in the UK. I don't know how at your institution that works, but if you can contact that person, they would be able, you could at least report to them. I did that. I never got any feedback around anything because I got some harassing emails, but nothing happened from it. But realistically, like, once you've submitted and your Viva's done, or like once you've submitted and you're done, the institution, you're not at the institution anymore. So they don't have that duty of care to you anymore. As you're looking for jobs, that would be a thing to sort of pay attention to, because you might have to, in a lot of places, people have to start their own network because these networks are sort of underground at the university. They're not run through the administrative pieces. So it might be worth feeling out amongst your community if anyone knows anyone at institutions where you're interviewing, so you can connect with them. If you're going to go and find out what exists at that institution. Some institutions do have very explicit stuff, but it's fewer and further between. But yeah, I definitely understand and feel your pain, because it's essentially very much what I went through. And I was studying manosphere groups and all that good stuff, far right, at a university in the US South. Yeah, it was great winning.
Let me just jump in. So unfortunately, the UK duty of care towards students is not much more than it is in. It is something which is being talked about. So there is a really flimsy duty of care, but that really just hits the kind of what you would think is like the crisis situation type thing. So if you get a death threat or something, then sure, but it's not going to cover like the vast majority of things here. And the kind of problem, and I'm just going to compound to the problem, unfortunately, this is not one that I have a good answer to. And this is something that Ashley and Ashton wrote about in their excellent book chapter. The intersection of academic freedom and that kind of protection gets really blurred and really, really difficult. And the powers that be will kind of just rest on their laurels and say, well, you don't have to do this. And that's really problematic from an academic freedom perspective. And then it just kind of gets to this point of how you conceptualize what it is exactly kind of a duty of care towards either employees or students actually entails. Is it a duty of care under every single circumstance to kind of explore academic freedom, to whatever it is you deem to be socially important? Or is it kind of a much more watered down version, which is what I suspect it actually is in practice, where they say, okay, well, we'll provide you with some level of care, but you also don't have to be doing things which are going to, in their mind, inflame and potentially cause, people to target you. And that's a really bad situation. I think the point that Ashton and Ashley make is that I'll let them speak for themselves, but that's a very bad situation, and I completely agree.
Yeah, I'll add in as well. I actually have the complete opposite experience. The reason that I wanted to stay at Southampton is because they were so good when I was getting harassed. And this was happening when I was in the transition, like you were, about the same time period. and they were so good. So I remember I was involved, Ashley was also involved with like a huge campaign of networked harassment a couple of years ago following the collapse of a centre. And my institution, it was Friday night, and they came out immediately and said publicly that they were supporting me, also behind the scenes. That we have a whole legal team here that is ready to support you if you start getting problems. And also, like, some of my experiences actually came from the online to offline, where people have turned up at my office. And there's been a whole conversation about even putting cards access onto just our departments. They take it so seriously, even that one case. So I would say that one of the things is, like, when you're looking for a job, like certainly for me, when I was on the job market, that was really important. Like, what do you have in place for your researchers? Again, money is a big part of this. Does your institution have the financial ability to be able to put that in place for you? We have counselling here, we have money for counselling. Yeah, that's something I would say as you go on the job market, like, look at those things, because they are really important. You don't want to be left on your own, and also not every institution is going to be able to support you in that way, and that was a really big deal. And a lot of the time they just don't know what to do at all. Like, they haven't experienced this. Like, in my institution, it's just me. Like, I'm the person that does this research and brought this to the kind of like forefront, and they changed stuff for me. So it is something that can happen. It's just like finding one that won't be like, I know people that have been just completely iced out, and it's like, you're on your own, you're bringing us negative attention, because they tag your institution in quite a lot. But yeah, I do feel for you, and I will say that there are positive, institutions that will support you. You just need to find them.
Thank you so much.
Anyone else interested in sharing their own experiences, perhaps questions, experiences, everything?
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, sorry. I actually don't have access to a camera, so I'm just gonna sort of hover anonymously here for a moment. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, as all have said, for that. That was so helpful, especially when you are sort of one of the only ones in your institution doing this particular kind of stuff. It's nice to sit in a room of like-minded people. I have a sort of two-part. They're, I suppose, both sort of small questions. The first one is kind of about the risk based off of different types of researches, different types of research. I know, for example, in the report and things that talk about doing really active research, participant heavy research, of course, things like what Ashton was doing, I would describe that very much being in the trenches, as you will. And what I do sort of is more indirect than that. So I'm wondering about, when it comes to these external threats, or sorry, external harm, are you somehow mitigating a little bit of that just by being one step removed? So that's my first question. And then the second one, sorry, I'm asking two, but the second one is, I'm wondering what steps you take in your own lives. Like, are you guys people that try to keep a low profile otherwise? I know this is a common thing that I've seen from people in conferences working on similar things. Some people are basically ghosts online, and they don't do these public. So I was just wondering if you could share something about how you guys approach that. But yes, thank you. I will stop now. Thank you.
So if you don't mind if I jump in, so I would say compared to the way Ashton does her work, I am also more of that like level of abstraction away, right? Like, I read websites, right? I don't go undercover. I don't put myself in those positions. I don't do participant work. So if this maybe helps, what I would say is, I've never had an incident based on the research I do. I have incidents based on when I engage with the public. So like the first time I had a problem, it was because my paper title was announced in a conference program. It was probably actually TASM, Joe. And someone saw it on Twitter and started harassing me. The sort of second time it happened, I gave quotes to a guy from a newspaper. He asked me for information based on a paper I had written. And sort of one of the influencers he was talking about in this newspaper in the Netherlands picked at me because they could use the fact that I was a US scholar, not from the Netherlands, as a leverage, and they sicked like their entire following on me, which was delightful because I was away at a conference, so I was like not at home. Everything started blowing up, right? And it was just all this stuff in Dutch, so I couldn't understand it, and then I felt like I had to translate it. So I had to learn a lot on the ground in that one, like how to mute things, how to not look at them, how to have a friend look at it for you, because you can't like look at it on a plane, and you can't also be having a panic attack on the plane about it, right? So the relationship of having external harm to the type of research is not one-to-one, right? In many cases, it just depends on how you publicize like work, right? So internet researchers, women internet researchers get harassed even when they don't write about this topic. So, you know, there's stuff there. What I would say is people respond differently. So we talk about this a little bit in our chapter, Ashton's and mine, but I talk about it in this one that I have coming out in January. Specifically, I talk about my experience a little bit more. And like, for me, I sort of got two lines of advice. One was, hey, if the bad guys are mad at you, you're doing the right thing. I hate that. Like, I get it. People are trying to make it less painful. They're trying to help, but I think that's a really not correct idea. And the other one was basically like, don't feed the trolls. There's a third option that some people do, which is they attack back, but you need a networked response to do that. So you need a community to help you do that. You can't just do it by yourself. You have to have people like pile on in response. So my option, I ended up not feeding the trolls because I was on the job market and I didn't want it to keep going like endlessly online and potential institutions I was interviewing with see all this stuff online. That was a choice, but then I felt isolated by that, right? Like, so each choice has different outcomes and you have to kind of think about what your capacity for that is. Like, you may not want to fight back. Like, that's an okay response. You don't have to. You don't have to take more abuse. But you can't control what other people do either. So sometimes people find that old stuff and harass me again for a little bit. It doesn't last as long. But like, you can also change your mind. You can start out being like, I'm not going to feed the trolls, and then decide later, like, you know what, I'm done with this. I'm going to fight back. I'm going to get people to help me, right? And your plan might go out the window and you might have to plan something new based on how you're reacting to something. And that's all okay. The biggest sort of thing is to sort of think about what makes you comfortable from the outset and start there. So things like whenever I post something online now, because I really reduced my online posting, I don't share very much. I don't share opinions. Like, I only publicize research. Like, my following numbers dropped because I made that choice. But that's what makes me feel comfortable, because I do get anxiety every time now, right? And that's something for me to work on, right? Because it's just part of it. So what I do is, before I'm going to share something, I lock my account so people can't automatically follow me. People can't respond to my messages if they're not a follower already. And that gives me a sense of control over what's going to happen. I can't control everything, but it certainly gives me a lot more control over the things that I have to deal with directly. Like I said, you can talk to someone about looking at comments for you. You can like work through friendships, work through supports, whether like if you had an advisor, like in one case, one of my mentors did it for me because I was traveling and I couldn't do it myself. So other people who work in this area will help you with things like that because we've experienced it too. So figuring out who your like buddies are in that sense would also be very helpful. And then ultimately, like, it really needs to be driven by the things that make you comfortable, even if that doesn't seem to make sense to other people, right? Because you're the one who has to be inhabiting your online persona. So I would say getting all the information you can, reading different pieces like we have, or talking to people is going to help you formulate what you think is the best plan, and then just be gentle with yourself. Once that plan has to be activated, or if it has to be activated, if you need to change it, that's okay. So that's sort of my take on it.
Yeah, can I just add to that? So, oh, sorry, Joe, did you want to go first? I just
you
saw
go,
your
Ashton, that's
box glow.
No, go for it.
Yeah, I wasn't involved in the Reassure project, but some of the things that were mentioned, I think, are quite interesting in what you were saying about like just certain research and is it more of an ethical issue? Is it more psychologically damaging? Like personally for me, when I was researching ISIS, I was looking at the really intense execution videos that was part of, because my dissertation was on like the theatrical displays of execution. And I started having recurring nightmares that I was getting blown up by a suicide bomber. And obviously you've got like no control over that at all. And I remember having conversations with like much more senior academics, because originally when I started my PhD, I was doing Islamic State and I switched to the far right just because at the time it was understudied. This is going back a few years ago now. And I remember talking to people at conferences and they were basically everything that Joe was mentioning in his presentation. They were like giving us suggestions. And it used to really irritate me because there was this assumption in the field that I couldn't study this because I was a woman. And when I would tell them what I was doing, they would actually ask me if I had a male supervisor. Do you have a male supervisor though? Like, is there a man present in this in this vicinity? And like I think that is a big problem as well. Like sometimes when you're trying to get ethical clearance, like for me, it was much more difficult to get clearance to do ISIS than it was the far right. Institutionally, the far right is seemed as like a lot less problematic. But Ashley and I did an event actually a couple of years ago, and like one of the people on the panel was told she couldn't do her research into the far right because she was a woman of color. And her institution was just like, no. And I feel like some of the issues around this are really important. And, you know, personally for me, I do things that some people consider more risky in terms of like being docs, cybersecurity, mental health. But like, I think if it's okay for you, then it should be okay for other people. And certainly for me, I've definitely had a backlash from people in the community that are like, oh, how can you be doing this? Almost as if they're trying to police how you should be feeling. And when you're not feeling traumatized and you don't feel the way that other people have the right to feel, it's almost as if that is problematic as well. Certainly that's what I've found anyway.
Yeah, I'll be quite brief because I think we're a bit over time, aren't we, John? So apologies. In terms of the question, I do kind of a mix of participant and passive, but I think it's I think it's just sort of in terms of how much you publicize yourself. I kind of made the choice to publicize myself quite a lot and then accept that there would be some blowback afterwards. And I personally found that actively making that choice does help to mitigate it to some extent. It does make you feel like you are somewhat in control. And exactly as Ashley just said, you can change that strategy later on. That's totally fine. It is fine to withdraw yourself and lock your Twitter and take all these kind of evasive actions. That's totally fine. In terms of the second question, things that I do to try and mitigate the fact that I do try and be quite public, stuff like my office number is not on my website. I know Ashley said that's not an option for her because it's publicly funded, but you'll probably find if you've got an office and you're not in the US in a publicly funded institution, it may well be possible. Definitely do that. I never tweet where I'm at if I'm at a conference. Well, oh yeah, brilliant in Lisbon. No, don't do that until you've left the vicinity. Just these kind of pretty standard OPSEC type things that can kind of mitigate a wanting to be able to publicize your research and therefore not suffer the professional harms of what we're doing here.
Brilliant. Thank you all.
Thank you, Joe. I think I saw a question by Mustafa Marwa on the chat. I'm not sure if Mustafa, you'd like to unmute yourself and just ask it, or otherwise I'm happy to read it. Okay. So Mustafa says, I think universities should be responsible for us after graduation since they own the copyright of our researches. And I think Ashley also did touch on how research particularly brings a lot of funds into university. So it's something, of course, that ideally we would all be happy if this is how it happened. Sadly enough, maybe it doesn't happen that way. And then Mustafa also says, shouldn't we have a global institution that would actually monitor, train and guide us and protect us in our research at whichever stages we are in? And then again, I'm going to leave it to the panelists to sort of think around how possible this would be. And the other aspect is, yes, we are going to share the resources that Ashley posted up, as well as you could find more resources on our VOX-Pol website. And in relation to the second part of the Reassure project, I'd say keep up with our VOX-Pol website, and as soon as we have an idea of when it's going to be out, those details are going to be posted up there. So I will pass over to either Ashley, Joe, Ashton, or anyone in the room that feels they want to chime in before we go back to Eliza. I hope I said that correctly.
Okay. I think we just got into a pattern of me being mouthy. Sorry, y'all. So institutional responsibility, like there's a difference between maybe what we feel should happen and what can happen. Unfortunately, I do agree that there needs to be something more robust, but like I said, so the academy works through the disciplinary structure primarily in terms of how it deals with these problems. And so that would sort of preclude like a global institute, because we can't even agree across a discipline in a locality, right? Yet for this, there is no discipline of internet studies. So people are working as much as they can. That's why I suggested joining like the AOIR, making sure you stay connected to VOX-Pol and other places that focus on this, because the information, like those are the best ways to network into having your own sort of network for it as it develops. Like this research is new, you know, like anthropology's been around for 200 plus years. This is new. We'll get there hopefully eventually. But standards, like people are still working on what is standards, what is best practice. Different fields think differently about that. And so it's being debated and negotiated and talked about as we do it in practice. In terms of for students, it's really complicated. Like that is a very complicated issue because different institutions in different places treat PhDs as different functions. Right. So like the way a PhD is done in one country is not the way it's done in another country, which has labor implications. Different sort of supranational bodies like the EU, their labor regulations are different than, say, labor regulations in the US. And all of those sort of laws and regulations impact how different levels in the academy are based on what institutions have to comply with. So again, it's not as simple a structure as it sounds when we talk about being an academic. It's not. It's much more fragmented and disparate than that underneath. But I would certainly say there are quite a few people who are concerned with this now. You might even have people at your own institution that could help support you as someone doing a doctorate or a master's. It's worth checking because a lot of these again are in sort of quieter networks of people working on difficult topics that know this stuff.
Very little to add apart from that. I very much agree. It's difficult enough to organise a single institution's norms, let alone a nation's norms, let alone a continent's norms, let alone a global one. It would end up having to be so patchwork. Think about things like UN resolutions and things like that, that it would end up just not being useful because there are no global standards of research and ethics and well-being and things like that. So to be able to cover the whole world and fit everything and make everyone happy, it would basically have to be meaningless anyway. So the trick is these things like AOIR that span the world and can provide idea for practice that we can all learn from and we can kind of use as part of our ethics applications and project design and things like that. So it is about a global reach, but a governing body would be a complete nightmare.
Thank you, Joe.
I was just going to say something for 1 second, because I know we're really over and I want Alyssa to have her chance to speak. I would also say just like you can reach out to any of us, like if you have questions. We have a really powerful network, and a lot of us have helped each other through many, many dark times. And I would say that feel free to be a part of that as well. And if you do have questions or you want more advice or you get in a sticky spot, you can just reach out and we will help you.
Thank you, Ashton. Eliza, do you want to go next?
Yeah, so just spurred on by something that Grace and Joe mentioned. So I don't know if I'm the only one who feels this, but I feel like there's so much pressure for us to be visible academics and be impactful academics. I have never experienced that in the same degree as I have now doing this PhD at my home institution. We were told that it's not really enough to publish anymore. You should be writing blogs, you should be doing podcast appearances, you should be having your own website that you make on your own time without being paid, you should be liaising with stakeholders. But I feel like as somebody who does extremism research, a lot of that public visibility is at odds with my well-being and my safety. And it sort of falls on deaf ears when I talk to people who are beyond this extremism sphere, but who are in my discipline of crim. And they're like, oh, well, I do anti-money laundering and it's great. I've got all these book chapters and I'm on these websites and all of these things. And I'm sort of wondering, I know Joe touched on it a bit, and the active choice to be a visible academic. How do you sort of handle the harms of trying to be safe while also not falling into the publish or perish sort of thing, and making sure that your name gets out there and you have impact and you have a job at the end of this? Again, a very existential question. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, I want to go first on this one because we just talked about this in my institution, because I'm at a Russell group and they're obsessed with impact. And I refuse to publish in anything that is mainstream. I will not do news. I will not do The Conversation. I will not do Open Democracy because of the abuse that I have had when I've published in them. And we had this whole session where it was like impact, impact, impact. And I was like, no, you can do impact in other ways. And I think that a lot of people just do not get it, that you cannot. So when I did The Economist recently, and I did it without mentioning my name, because I was like, I am not giving, I just won't do it because of the backlash that I've had from doing public things. And I think what you're saying is really important, because certainly for me, like you were saying, in my department now, like ref is less important than impact, and it's about like the public engagement and stuff. But personally, I can tell you that I have just refused to do it, and I still have a job, so there's hope for us all. But I totally feel your pain on that one, 100%.
But I mean, there's just also different kinds of impacts. So something like, I would feel a lot safer doing a VOX-Pol blog than I would doing Open Democracy. I would feel a lot safer doing specific podcasts than I would giving a news quote at this point. I used to do tons of them. Like, if you look at my CV, I was in a lot of news pieces, and then the shit hit the fan, right? And I'm like, nope, no more of that. You can also see if your university or wherever you are looking for a job does media training. It's not going to be perfect for what you need, but media training will help you understand better. Like, one of the things I didn't know when I was first doing news stories was the questions I needed to ask the interviewer and what was acceptable. And that kind of crap, like, there is stuff I would never tolerate today from a journalist that would put me in harm's way. Like, I ask up front now, and if they aren't okay with where I'm at, and it's just even something as simple as notifying me before they publish so I can lock down my social media, then I don't work with them. So you can actually do that. So there are other factors that you just don't know because you haven't done it, right? And we don't get trained in it. So I would definitely suggest that as well. And I would see if you can find on if it's UKRI or in the US, it would be like Impact is Still a Thing. It's just got a different name. I know there's a really good guide. It's for social science, so it would probably work for you. It's called NABI. It's about how to do impact under the NSF. But it's just really good at explaining different types of impact activities. And that would be a resource, like you can message me on it. I'm sure I've got it somewhere. That would be a resource you could even point to, like, here are the things I do because I can't do that or I won't do that. And this is valid, right? So there are little things like that you might be able to use too.
I'll be really, really quick, because I'm aware we're very over time now. This is a really precarious question, especially for PhD students, because once you get that academic job, if academia is where you want to go, you do have other pathways in there. So most universities will delineate between teaching pathways, research pathways. That means you can get out of the publish or perish thing to some extent. Then the question is that what you're comfortable with, and things like that. But that at least puts the choice back in your hands. But unfortunately, it is not really something that the PhD student have, because let's face it, the academic job market is very much you've got to take the academic jobs that come up, whether they're teaching enhanced, research enhanced, I&E enhanced, or whatever. So and one of the things our report repeatedly comes back to is that postgraduate research students are particularly at risk. But I guess I'll try and say, once you do get that job, you do have more options, but I know that doesn't really help you now, so I apologize.
It was a Russell Group uni, so that's the training we had was impact, talk to government, and I was like, no,
impact government, make us money, but
yep,
do it in a formal way.
Yeah, I had a government guy tell me I couldn't use the word misogyny to talk about the manosphere.
Oh my God.
Sorry.
I love it. It's my experience as well. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much. I think we could actually go on for a while and talk about so many of the issues, and it's really interesting conversations as well as experiences. What I was going to say is keep tabs with our network and the kind of events that we organize, because this is not going to be the only workshop. We are going to have many similar workshops organized around other areas as well in online extremism research. So with that, I'd like to say thank you so much for coming to our workshop. Thank you so much to the presenters, and thank you for giving us 2 hours of your time. Like it's 2 hours, you know. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.